Before we get into today's case, a quick warning. This story involves the murder of two young teenagers, and we're going to talk about real evidence, real audio, and a community that lived in fear for years. Please take care of yourself while you listen. Today we're going back to Delphi, Indiana, an American town of roughly 3,000 people, surrounded by cornfields and two-lane highways, the kind of place where kids walk to school, everyone knows everyone's business, and violent crime usually means a bar fight that gets a little out of hand. It's the last place most people would picture when they hear about a double homicide that grips the entire country. And yet, on one unseasonably warm winter afternoon in 2017, two best friends walked onto an old railroad bridge just outside of town and never came home. You've probably heard at least one tiny piece of this story, even if you didn't realize it at the time. A low male voice caught on a teenager's phone, saying two words that would haunt investigators for years. Down the hill. It's one of the most famous audio clips in American true crime. Behind those few seconds is a longer recording, roughly 43 seconds in all, and a still photo of a man in jeans and a blue jacket walking along the rotting wooden ties of Monon High Bridge. Those images and that audio came from a 14-year-old girl who had the presence of mind to hit record on her phone, even as she realized that something was very, very wrong. Tonight, we're going to walk through Abby and Libby's final day, step by step. We'll talk about what's on that phone, what police have, and haven't, shared with the public, the massive investigation that followed, and how it took more than 5 years for a name to finally be attached to the shadowy figure known worldwide as Bridge Guy. And we'll talk about where the case stands now, with a man convicted and serving a 130-year sentence, even as appeals move forward. So settle in, keep things respectful in the comments, and let's start where this story really begins. Not on the bridge, but in the lives of two girls who were so much more than victims. Delphi is the kind of Midwestern county seat that feels frozen in time. A brick courthouse in the center of town, a handful of fast food places and diners, church steeples breaking the skyline, basketball in the winter, Friday night football in the fall. If you grew up in small-town America, you know this place even if you've never been there. It's the town where you wave at people just because you recognize their car, where the local paper still runs honor roll lists and Little League photos, and where serious crime feels like something that happens somewhere else. Abigail Abby Williams was 13. She loved art and animals, especially her cat, and she played saxophone in the school band. Friends described her as the kind of kid who might seem a little shy at first, but turned goofy once she felt comfortable. The one who'd say, "Come on, we're doing this," when someone hesitated. She liked photography and being outside, and she was in that middle school in-between stage. Still into sleepovers and crafts, starting to care about how she looked on social media, caught right between childhood and full-on teenage life. Libby German, 14, was energetic and competitive. She played volleyball and softball, she swam, and she was involved in school activities. She was close to her family, especially her older sister, Kelsey. Libby was tech-savvy and loved her phone, texting friends, posting on Snapchat, taking pictures. That phone, just a normal part of teenage life, would end up becoming one of the most important pieces of evidence in an American homicide case. Abby and Libby were best friends, the kind of pair you find in every small town. They had sleepovers, inside jokes, shared TikTok before TikTok energy. They knew each other's families, bedrooms, favorite snacks. On the weekend of February 12, 2017, Abby slept over at Libby's house. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just a normal Sunday night before what should have been a lazy Monday. School was closed the next day, an unexpected break in the middle of winter. Monday, February 13th, 2017, started quietly. It was unseasonably warm for Indiana in February, with temperatures in the 50s. The girls had banana pancakes for breakfast, made by Libby's dad. The mood in the house was relaxed. No school, no rush for the bus, just the open stretch of a bonus day. At some point late that morning, Libby started talking about going to the trails, the Delphi historic trails along Deer Creek, with the old Monon High Bridge towering over the water. It was a local spot, a little risky because the bridge itself was abandoned and in rough shape, but it was also a go-to backdrop for photos. If you've never seen it, Monon High Bridge is striking. Built in 1891, it was once a railroad trestle, standing more than 60 feet above Deer Creek. There are no guardrails, just weathered railroad ties with gaps between them and open sky and water below. By 2017, it had been abandoned for decades. Officially, it wasn't meant to be walked on. Unofficially, for teens and photographers, it was part thrill, part view, part local legend. Walking across it meant stepping from one warped tie to the next, watching your footing, feeling the height in your stomach. Late that morning, Libby asked her older sister, Kelsey, for a ride out there. At first, Kelsey hesitated. She had her own plans, but eventually she agreed. Libby's dad said he could pick them up later in the afternoon. It was a plan that felt safe enough. Daylight, a popular trail, a set pickup time, 2 girls together. Sometime around 1:35 p.m., Kelsey pulled up near the trail access on County Road 300 North, east of the Hoosier Heartland Highway, and dropped the girls off. There were the usual last-minute adjustments, borrowed sweatshirt, quick chat, maybe a reminder about when to be back. Then Abby and Libby headed down the path. That was the last time any family member saw them alive. Just after 2 p.m., Libby did what teenagers do. She pulled out her phone and opened Snapchat. At about 2:07 p.m., she posted a photo of Abby walking across Monon High Bridge. Abby in jeans and a sweatshirt, arms slightly out for balance on the uneven boards, the creek valley stretching out behind her. It's a simple image. If you didn't know what came next, it would look like any other snapshot from a day outdoors. Between that 2:07 p.m. photo and the next key moment in this story, something shifted. Based on investigative records and later courtroom testimony, around 2:13 p.m., Libby started recording video as a man approached them on the bridge. For years, the public saw only a single still frame from that clip, and they heard only a few seconds of audio. It wasn't until much later that the existence of a roughly 43-second recording was widely acknowledged. In that video, Abby is walking ahead, the way kids do when they're half posing, half playing around. Behind her, you can see a man in a dark jacket and jeans, his hands in his pockets, head slightly down. The camera shakes as the person holding the phone walks along the ties. The girls sound different than they did in earlier, carefree clips. There are sniffles, faster breathing, a tightness in their voices. One of them comments on the man behind them. They talk about the path, where they might go down. It feels like that moment where something that was fun starts to feel wrong, and the body registers danger before the brain fully catches up. Then you hear the male voice that would become infamous. First he says, "Guys," and one of the girls responds, a small, uncertain hi. A few seconds later, the voice gives a short, flat command. "Down the hill." Those are the words the public has heard countless times, on TV, podcasts, press conferences. According to investigators, somewhere around that moment, one of the girls also mentions a gun. Then the video ends. That's the last time Abby and Libby's voices are heard. Meanwhile, away from the trail, the day was still moving on a normal schedule. Libby's dad, Derek, was supposed to pick them up around 3:15 p.m. When he arrived at the agreed spot, they weren't there. At first, it wasn't cause for full-blown panic. Kids lose track of time. Phones die. Maybe the girls were still on the bridge, or had wandered farther down the trail. Derek called Libby's phone. No answer. He walked the paths himself, calling their names. Still nothing. As the minutes stretched and the sun dipped lower in the winter sky, concern hardened into fear. By around 5:30 p.m., after the family and a few others had searched without success, law enforcement was called. Local police, Carroll County deputies, and community volunteers began searching the trails and surrounding areas. It was already getting dark. February in Indiana doesn't give you a long evening. At that point, authorities were treating it as a missing persons situation, 2 girls lost or hurt in rough terrain. Despite the growing anxiety, there was still a sense of "we'll find them." As night fell and conditions worsened, the official search was paused, with plans to resume at first light. On the morning of February 14th, searchers were back. They combed the area in daylight, paying special attention to the banks of Deer Creek. Late that morning, a volunteer spotted something that didn't look right across the water, some color against the winter landscape. As searchers closed in, they realized what they were seeing. 2 bodies near the creek's edge, a short distance from the bridge but off the main trail. Word traveled fast among those searching, but the public message was cautious, a sheriff telling reporters that the discovery was not good. Soon after, authorities confirmed that the remains were those of Abigail Williams and Liberty German. From that moment, Delphi wasn't just a quiet Midwestern town anymore. It was the center of a double homicide investigation. When children or teenagers are murdered in the U.S., investigators often withhold certain details, like the exact cause of death, specific injuries, or crime scene conditions. They do this to protect the integrity of the case. If someone comes forward with a confession or a tip, police can test how much they know against facts that were never made public. That's exactly what happened here. For years, the official line was simply that foul play was suspected. The exact cause of death and the specifics of how the girls were found remained tightly sealed until the case finally went to trial. Within days of the discovery, investigators had their first public clue ready to release. On February 15th, Indiana State Police held a press conference and shared a grainy still image taken from Libby's phone. A heavy-set man walking along the Monon High Bridge, wearing a dark jacket and blue jeans, hands in his pockets. The quality was poor, but enough to make out a general build and outfit. Online, he quickly became known as Bridge Guy. Not long after, investigators released a short audio clip from the same recording. The public heard that now familiar voice saying, "Down the hill." Police explicitly credited Libby as a hero for hitting record and capturing both the video and the audio. It was a unique moment. In a lot of older cases, we're left with witness memories and reconstructed timelines. Here, one of the victims herself had managed to document the approach of the man who would kill her. It felt like something out of a movie, but this wasn't fiction. It was raw, real audio that would echo through this case for years. Once the photo and audio were out, the tips started. And they didn't stop. Hundreds, then thousands of leads came in. The FBI joined the investigation. A dedicated tip line was set up. People from across the country called in names of ex-boyfriends, estranged relatives, weird former neighbors, anyone who vaguely resembled the man in that grainy image or sounded like the clipped, Midwestern voice saying, "Down the hill." In July 2017, police released a composite sketch based on witness accounts from people who had seen a man on the trails that day. The sketch showed a middle-aged man with a goatee, wearing a cap. For 2 years, that face was attached to the name Bridge Guy in the public's mind. Then, in April 2019, investigators held a dramatic press conference. They announced what they called a new direction in the case and released a second sketch. This one looked noticeably younger and slimmer, with no facial hair and different features. They said they now believed this new sketch was the primary person of interest, and that the first sketch might represent a different individual or be less central. For many people watching from the outside, this was confusing. 2 very different sketches, both supposedly related to the same man on the bridge. For Delphi residents, who had already spent years looking sideways at every stranger and even some friends, the announcement brought a mix of hope and frustration. Hope that the case was moving forward. Frustration that the target seemed to keep shifting. While the investigation churned, the town tried to figure out how to live with what had happened. If you picture a place where kids used to ride bikes across town and spend hours outside without checking in, now add a layer of fear. Parents who had always told their kids, "Just be home by dark," suddenly insisted on constant updates. Kids who grew up exploring the woods thought twice. The idea that this might have been done by someone passing through was terrifying. The idea that it might have been done by someone local was, in a different way, even worse. Community meetings were held. Law enforcement representatives and city leaders talked about safety. A task force looked at improvements along the trails, including cameras and better markings for emergency response. Meanwhile, Abby and Libby's families channeled their grief into something concrete. A memorial park, Abby and Libby Memorial Park, with sports fields and spaces for kids, somewhere their names and spirits could live on in a positive way. National media took notice. The case appeared on TV news and true crime shows. Podcasts devoted entire seasons to it. A documentary series walked through the timeline and theories. Later, a docuseries would focus not just on the crime, but on the families and the long wait for answers. Through all of this attention, one thing remained the same: no arrest. Year after year, the man in the bridge photo was still just an anonymous figure. So what finally broke the case? The answer, at least as prosecutors later told it, starts with a tip that got lost in the shuffle, and a clerk who refused to let it stay that way. Just a few days after the murders, 3 days, according to later records, a man named Richard Allen walked into a conservation officer's office and said he had been on the trails that afternoon. He said he'd gone out to Monon High Bridge to watch fish, that he'd seen 3 girls on the trail, and that he hadn't noticed anything unusual. The officer took down the information and filed the report. But Allen's last name was misspelled, and the tip was misfiled in a way that effectively buried it. On paper, the lead was marked as having been followed up and cleared. For years, that was that. Then, in 2022, a civilian working in the office, essentially a file clerk, was reviewing old notes and noticed something odd. The tip about a man on the trail that day, with a name very close to Richard Allen, hadn't been fully explored. The clerk dug further, realized the likely spelling error, and brought it back to supervisors. Once investigators connected that tip to the Richard Allen who lived in Delphi, things began to move. Allen wasn't just some random hiker. He lived locally and had for years. He worked at the CVS pharmacy in town, the kind of place where half the town would have seen him behind the counter picking up prescriptions. According to later accounts, he had told his wife back in 2017 that he'd been on the trail that day, something she reportedly didn't think much of at the time. When investigators re-interviewed Allen in October 2022, he again admitted being at the trail on February 13, 2017. He said he wore jeans and a blue or black jacket, and described walking out onto the bridge. That description sounded a lot like the outerwear seen in the video from Libby's phone. From there, things escalated quickly. Police obtained a search warrant for his home. During that search, they seized multiple items, including a SIG Sauer .40 caliber handgun and clothing. Back in 2017, investigators had found an unspent .40 caliber round near the girls' bodies. It wasn't a fired bullet. It was a cartridge that had been cycled through a gun but not discharged. Forensic examiners tested that cartridge against Allen's pistol. Their conclusion, presented later in court, was that the unspent round bore markings consistent with having been cycled through his firearm. In American courts, ballistics comparisons like this are considered valid evidence, although they're not as definitive as something like DNA. The strength of that kind of evidence often comes down to how the jury views the expert testimony. In this case, the state treated the ballistic match as a central piece of the story tying Allen's gun to the crime scene. On October 26, 2022, more than 5 years after Abby and Libby were killed, police arrested Richard Allen. He was charged with 2 counts of murder. At the first press conference after his arrest, officials were cautious. They said the investigation was still active. They hinted there might be other people with information. Even the probable cause affidavit, the document explaining why they believed Allen was connected to the crime, was initially sealed from public view. Allen pleaded not guilty. Once a person is formally charged with murder in the United States, a whole different machine kicks into gear. This isn't just about detectives and tips anymore. Now you have prosecutors, defense attorneys, pretrial hearings, court orders, and strict rules about what can be said publicly. Because this case was so high profile, and because Delphi is so small, a gag order was put in place to limit public statements. Defense attorneys pushed for the trial to be moved out of Carroll County, arguing that potential jurors had been too exposed to years of coverage to be fair. At different points, there were major disputes over who would represent Allen, including a controversy involving leaked crime scene photos that led to his attorneys being removed and later reinstated. Over time, the charges against him were expanded. Prosecutors added counts of felony murder linked to kidnapping. Under Indiana's felony murder rule, if someone dies during the commission of a serious felony like kidnapping, the person committing that felony can be charged with murder even if the state doesn't prove a specific intent to kill in the traditional sense. It's a legal tool that allows prosecutors to present multiple theories of liability to a jury. For the public, this stage felt quiet. They still had only those same few seconds of audio and the still image from the bridge. But behind courtroom doors, judges, lawyers, and experts were fighting over what evidence a jury would eventually hear. The trial finally began in October 2024. For the first time, a jury, and eventually the public, saw the full 43-second video from Libby's phone. They saw Abby walking across the bridge. They saw the man behind them, head down, hands in his pockets. They heard the girls' nervous voices. And then they heard that low, almost emotionless command, down the hill. Prosecutors argued that the man in that video was Richard Allen. They called witnesses who placed a man in a blue jacket and jeans on the trails that day. One witness described seeing a man later in the afternoon who appeared muddy and bloody, walking away from the area where the girls were found. They walked the jury through the misfiled 2017 tip, the renewed focus in 2022, the search warrant, and the handgun. They also presented the ballistics expert who testified that the unspent cartridge found near the bodies matched the gun from Allen's home. And they played something that hit in a very different way, recordings of Allen's phone calls from jail. In the United States, almost all inmate phone calls are recorded, and callers are warned of that fact at the start of each call. On several of those calls, made to his wife and his mother, Alan talked about the Delphi case and, according to prosecutors, admitted to killing Abby and Libby. Sometimes he seemed distraught. Sometimes he sounded resigned. The state argued that those calls were confessions, damaging, voluntary admissions that cut through any question about the strength of the physical evidence. The defense pushed back. They didn't deny that the recordings existed. Instead, they argued that Alan's mental health had severely deteriorated during his time in jail, pointing to long stretches in near-solitary conditions. They said he had become paranoid and delusional, talking about ritual sacrifice and bizarre motives that didn't line up with reality. In their view, the rambling, sometimes inconsistent statements on those calls were not trustworthy confessions, but the product of a man in psychological crisis. They highlighted what wasn't in the state's case, or at least not in a clear, definitive way. There was no single, public piece of DNA evidence that conclusively tied Alan to the scene in the way people expect from modern crime dramas. The ballistics analysis, they argued, was subjective and vulnerable to bias. They questioned the handling of evidence, the long delay between the murders and the arrest, and the many other individuals who had been looked at and publicly dissected over the years but never charged. For Abby and Libby's families, sitting in the courtroom meant finally hearing answers they had been denied for years, and answers they might have wished they could unhear. The cause of death, the description of injuries, the way the girls had been found. Details that most members of the public will never know, and maybe shouldn't. Details that can never be unseen by the people who loved them the most. On November 11, 2024, after hearing all of this, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Richard Allen guilty of multiple counts of murder related to Abby and Libby's deaths, including felony murder counts tied to kidnapping. In December, the judge sentenced him to 130 years in prison, the functional equivalent of a life sentence for a man in his 50s. She didn't mince words, describing the killings as among the worst she had seen, and emphasizing that Abby and Libby had done nothing more than go for a walk on a beautiful day off from school. For many people following the case, that sounded like closure. After years of press conferences, sketches, theories, and fear, there was a name, a conviction, a sentence. The man who prosecutors said was Bridge Guy was now inmate Allen, serving his time. But criminal cases, especially high-profile ones, don't necessarily end with a verdict. Allen's defense team quickly moved into the appeals process. They argued that the evidence was insufficient, that his confessions were not reliable, that certain decisions by the trial court were improper, and that he had been deprived of a fair trial. Supporters set up a website claiming his innocence. In a move that shocked many, that site released the full Bridge Guy video from Libby's phone, the same clip the jury had seen. For years, the public had known only a few seconds. Now, anyone with an internet connection could watch the longer recording for themselves. People who believe the jury got it right say the full video only strengthens the state's case. They see fearful girls, a suspicious man, and a chilling command. People who doubt the outcome look at the same footage and see ambiguity, room for alternative interpretations, and questions about identity. While those debates played out online, Allen himself was moved out of Indiana to a maximum security prison in Oklahoma as part of an interstate housing arrangement. It's a reminder that once a case reaches this stage, it stops being just a local story and becomes part of a larger system of corrections and appellate courts. So where does all of that leave Delphi? And where does it leave the rest of us, looking in from the outside? In a literal sense, the landscape has changed. Monon High Bridge has been repaired and incorporated into a formal trail system. New decking, railings, and safety features have been added to turn what was once a decaying, unofficial walkway into a maintained part of the community's paths. For visitors who didn't live through 2017, it might look like a scenic overlook on a nice hike. But for people who were there, who participated in the searches, who heard the sirens, who saw the news alerts, the bridge will always carry a different weight. When they picture it, they see two sets of young footsteps and another set following behind. Emotionally, the town has been through almost everything. Shock when the girls went missing, horror when their bodies were found, fear that a killer was still at large, frustration and anger as years went by without answers, relief when an arrest was finally announced, and now an uneasy mix of gratitude and doubt as appeals drag the case back into the headlines. Some residents are absolutely convinced the jury got it right and feel that the conviction and sentence brought as much justice as they're ever going to get. Others still whisper about alternate suspects, about tips they believe weren't fully explored, about the possibility that someone else was involved or that the entire story hasn't been told. That kind of split is not unusual in high-profile cases, especially ones that simmer for years before finally reaching trial. It's important to hold a couple of truths at the same time. Legally, as it stands, Richard Allen has been convicted beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law and sentenced accordingly. At the same time, he has the right to appeal, and his attorneys are exercising that right. Saying both of those things isn't fence-sitting, it's just recognizing how the American justice system is built. Verdicts happen in a courtroom. Appeals happen later, sometimes long after the cameras are gone. If you zoom out and look at this story from the perspective of true crime as a genre, it's easy to get caught up in the mystery elements. The grainy photo, the chilling audio, the conflicting sketches, the misfiled tip that almost changed everything. But at the center of it all are two real kids. Abby, who loved art and music, and her cat, who blew into her saxophone in school band and probably rolled her eyes when adults tried to be cool. Libby, who loved sports and Snapchat, who bickered and laughed with her sister, who woke up that morning excited about having a day off school and a chance to hang out with her best friend. They woke up on February 13th, 2017, made banana pancakes, asked for a ride to the trails, and did something incredibly brave when things started to feel wrong. They documented what was happening to them. Libby pointing her phone, hitting record, capturing that man's approach and voice. It didn't save their lives, but it ensured they would not be completely silenced. That shaky, frightened video gave investigators a starting point. It kept the case alive in the public's mind. Years later, it gave prosecutors something tangible to show and play for a jury. In a way, the voices from the bridge aren't just the killer's commands, they're Abby and Libby's voices, preserved in a digital file, still speaking for themselves after they were gone. This case also forces us to look at modern policing and where it succeeds and fails. On one side, you have advanced forensics, digital evidence, massive tip lines, and multi-agency cooperation. On the other, you have a critical tip that was misfiled and basically lost for years, waiting for a clerk to notice a typo. It's a stark reminder that for all the technology, so much of criminal justice still comes down to human beings doing meticulous, often unglamorous work, and human beings make mistakes. If you're a parent watching this, it's almost impossible not to think, what could they have done differently? And that's one of the most unsettling parts of the Delphi story. Abby and Libby weren't sneaking out at midnight. They weren't meeting an online stranger. They were together, in daylight, in a place local kids knew, with a set pickup time and family aware of where they were. They did a lot of things we would tell young teens to do. What their story really underlines is that danger doesn't always look like the stereotypes we grew up with. Sometimes it's not a white van in a parking lot, but a man on a familiar trail, in a familiar town, in the middle of the afternoon. That's not meant to scare you into locking your kids inside forever. It's meant to highlight why simple things like communicating plans clearly, listening to your gut when something feels off, and for adults, being present and available, matter so much. And sometimes, tragically, even when people do those things, someone else's choices still turn the world upside down. Finally, there's the question of how we, as consumers of true crime, interact with stories like this. That audio clip of Down the Hill is chilling. The still image from the bridge makes for a compelling thumbnail. The theories and speculation can be addictive. But every share, every comment, every slowed-down re-edit of that voice exists because two children were terrorized and murdered. If we're going to keep talking about this case, we owe Abby and Libby a certain level of respect. That means resisting the urge to play internet detective with real people's lives. Law enforcement in cases like this has repeatedly warned the public about blasting out side-by-side comparison photos of random men on social media just because they look like a sketch. Those posts can ruin innocent people's reputations, traumatize their families, and bog down real investigations with noise. So as we wrap up, here's where things stand. In 2017, Abby Williams and Libby German walked across Monon High Bridge on a warm February afternoon. Libby recorded a man following them and captured his voice ordering them down the hill. They were murdered near Deer Creek, and their bodies were found the next day. For more than 5 years, their killer was officially unknown, even as photos and audio from their final moments were broadcast around the world. A misfiled tip about a local man on the trail that day, a re-examination of old leads, a handgun and an unspent cartridge witness accounts, and recorded jailhouse phone calls eventually led investigators to Richard Allen. In 2024, a jury convicted him of multiple counts of murder, and he was sentenced to 130 years in prison. His appeals are ongoing. The full bridge video is now widely available. Monon High Bridge has been repaired and integrated into a safer trail, and Abby and Libby's families have poured their grief into a memorial park so other kids in Delphi can play, grow, and just be kids. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, I'd like to ask you to do two things. First, if you talk about this case, online, at work, with friends, keep Abby and Libby at the center. Focus on verified information. Be cautious with rumors. Remember that behind every headline is a family that still has to wake up each morning and live with this. Second, take a moment to think about what safety means in your own life, your community, your family. Not in a fear-based, lock the doors and never go outside way, but in a practical, compassionate way. Most of all, remember Abby and Libby as more than a video clip or a haunting audio file. Remember them as two friends who should have had decades of inside jokes, bad haircuts, first apartments, and boring adult responsibilities. They didn't get that chance. But thanks to a split-second decision on a shaky bridge, their voices are still heard, their courage still matters, and their names are not forgotten.